Okay. All right. Well, welcome. And so good to have Anders Horn here today. I perhaps should have started recording earlier. He's been telling me all these great things about the people he's meeting and things that are happening in the field of medical devices and other regulatory consulting, which is his area of expertise. He is the director of business development and new markets at Accorto Regulatory Solutions, and he works on expanding partnerships, helping MedTech companies navigate the FDA process and other regulatory markets. He also was telling me about how he's generally looking for the talent in young startups and that sort of thing that he can support and he can mentor and help them be successful in this it's a very, on average, the returns from these areas are higher than normal, and then on average, they're higher than average. Does that make sense? So than general. And so it's a great field to be investing in. Well, why don't you go ahead and tell us what you've got?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as you explained, my name's Anders Horn. I am the Director of Business Development for Accordo Regulatory Solutions. And one of the main things that I do is I do work with small to mid-sized medical companies, mostly startups, who have a novel product that they are looking to gain acceptance, whether by FDA clearance or approval through the FDA and those pathways. And so with that being said, I do have a slideshow if that's okay for me to go ahead and share.
Yes, absolutely. I think you should be able to share okay.
Sounds good. I'm usually a Teams guy, so give me a second while I figure this out.
Yeah,
Uh,
I understand that. Going between them, always have to figure it out every time.
all right. Can you see my
You
screen all
see
right?
it? Do I see it? There we go. Yes,
We're
I
good?
can. Thank you. Looks good.
All
Yeah.
right, so awesome. So my presentation today is going to be strategically navigating the US FDA and regulatory landscape. And so my objective with this presentation is to provide some deeper context on how these regulations get applied and strategies on how to navigate all of this. For today's presentation, there's far too many product types to cover them all. And so we're really going to be focused on med device regulations as examples and principles and concepts that we want to cover. These tend to be transferable to other product categories, such as the use of 510(k) pathway for medical devices that have substantially equivalent predicates, which is comparable to concepts used by the ANDA process for drugs. Uh, where most there are comparisons between European and US regulatory standards, and I'm going to try to point those out today. My hope is that everybody that's watching this can benefit from the lessons, kind of from others' mistakes, to assist you a little bit and not have the burden of those mistakes and get your product on the market more efficiently. And I'm going to try to cover everything on these slides. Martha, obviously, if there's anything comes up that you want to stop me and just ask some questions, please feel free to do so. And yeah, with that, we'll be getting started.
All right.
And so obviously this is me. I'm on the right hand side, Anders Horn, Director of Business Development, two people, and I apologize that they're not here today, but I figured I could take this on by myself. But two other members of Accordo is going to be our president, Russ Rogers, and our COO, Jason Kroll. Two key components to our business. They both have over thirty years of regulated products. And personally, myself, I've got over 15 years of regulated products. I'm sorry, it's Monday, I can't talk. Regulated
Yeah.
products in the medical device space, specifically structural heart and general surgery. I've done preclinical and clinical experience in overseas in Europe, in former Soviet Union countries, as well as taken multiple products through the 510(k) clearance pathway in the US.
And you've got Europe, you've got Asia, Latin America, lots of experience.
Lots of experience. We have
Yeah.
partners all over the world as well that we work with. That also includes labs. And so, one of the main things that we
Mhm.
work with companies is a lot of US companies or companies overseas, they believe that they have to use a US lab, which, granted, usually those US labs are credentialed, but sometimes those US labs, the pricing for that testing is going to be extremely high, while there are other testing labs and other CROs who have preferential pricing. So, sometimes it's not always you have to use a US lab. You can use a credentialed lab and you can get special pricing for that, and all the data would work out as long as you do it in the correct and compliant manner. But I'll keep going and we can get to that in a little bit.
All right.
So at Accorda Regulatory Solutions, as I was mentioning before, we specialize in small to mid-sized domestic and international companies. That's not to say that we can't help out the large companies, but the large companies like Johnson and Johnson, Abbott, Medtronic, things like that, usually they have their own in-house regulatory teams that are rather large. So they're not primarily our demographic. Our real demographic are these small medical companies that really know their technology, that need assistance with the regulatory pathway. I love to tell people, you guys focus on your product, focus on what makes it great. Let us focus on the FDA and let us kind of speak that FDA lingo to help out with your applications. And so when it comes to that, we help companies develop a customized, cost-effective strategy to achieve FDA regulatory compliance. Our niche areas really include helping overseas company with already approved products in other countries, leveraging their existing applications by using as much of their pre-existing data as possible to streamline a U.S. application. There's a lot of companies that I work with that have unbelievable products that are overseas, but when it comes to the nuances of the FDA, they have a really hard time understanding what those are. And even though they have all the data, producing that dossier and putting it in FDA compliant manner for their applications can be difficult. And that's something that our company specializes in. That's something that we do every day. So when it comes to speaking the FDA language, we are able to take what other companies have in foreign countries, adapt it to how the FDA would see fit, and apply it. We also tend to do what we like to call internally as rescue projects. And these are projects with usually they're small to mid-sized companies. They've had a regulatory person that's been there for about 1 to, let's say, 10 years, and they've really been trying to get a product cleared or approved. And usually this person, they are so kind of bought into what they're doing that they almost create a sour relationship with the FDA. Instead of having a discussion about what the FDA is searching for, they almost become combative with the FDA, and they almost are telling the FDA of why their testing should suffice and why their product is fine and safe, instead of listening to the FDA, understanding what the FDA is asking from them. And so with this, we get a lot of these projects, which we come in, we take a second look at everything that's going on, the testing, we listen to the FDA and we listen to the person. And a lot of times we come in and alleviate the situation, alleviate the tension, and just kind of having that conversation with the FDA as a third party, it sometimes can help drive a more productive conversation, which in the end, we find to be successful.
Great.
And then, so the agenda for today's meeting, pretty straightforward. I apologize. I am going to just read off this slide because it is just bullet points. So the regulatory strategy, one of the most important things, initial considerations. Then we're going to jump into design considerations, regulatory application framework, 510(k) versus de novo. This is going to be really the main products for the FDA. There is also class 3 products, which are known as PMAs, and then class 1 and general wellness products, and we can touch on those a little bit too. Predicate selection, testing considerations, Q submission, what is a Q submission and how to get the answers you need, product development pipeline, planning for the future, and then the special programs through the FDA. So we're going to kick things off by talking about the most important concept that we will discuss today, which is the regulatory strategy and the needs to be considered almost at the beginning of new product development process. So most of the regulations that apply to your product are set in stone, and you just need to work within them. There are a few areas that you can control that influence what regulations will apply to your product. But we really want to discuss on the early stage considerations that influence how quickly you get through the regulatory process, how expensive that may be, how you take your product to market, and ultimately the market position you can establish from the outset. The earlier in the process that you start considering these factors, the better. And one of the reasons for that is if you start considering things in the beginning versus it's something that pops up at the very end of the project that you have to justify at the end, whether it's safety testing, biocomp, things like that, it might delay your product application. And so it's really good to get those considerations in the beginning. Three of the biggest factors that we want to discuss, I cannot speak. Three of the biggest factors we want to discuss are decisions you make around product designation and classification, indications for use, and the resulting application pathway. These key decisions that you make, they influence what regulations you'll have to deal with. And it's important to note the tools you have available to validate your decisions and assumptions within the FDA.
So validate what you're doing with a representative from the FDA. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And
Right.
we'll jump in
Okay.
a little bit more about that. I will be discussing about the Q submission process, which is one of the avenues that you can go and get the validation from the FDA.
Right. And the
Um,
earlier you do that, does that also increase the probability that you'll have a successful process through the FDA, or just speeds it up?
I would say it really defines what would have you have a successful FDA application. There's a lot of answers that you can get through the Q submission process. And when you get that interaction with the FDA, it'll help you define what needs to be done. And so there are a lot of people out there, for example, in the 510(k) pathway process, that they see a predicate device and they think that they can just do a one for one on the predicate without getting any FDA buy-in, which sometimes it does work. But then there's other times that they may have missed something, and without engaging in the FDA prior to their submission, they just send in their application, and the FDA comes back with with a rejection letter or some things that they need to go and fix prior to clearance of their product. And a lot of those things can be alleviated by way of a pre-submission meeting. And so I wouldn't say every time it's going to speed it up, but I would say if you're trying to save time and money, going a pre-submission pathway and getting the FDA buy-in and oversight on your project, it's going to be beneficial in the end. You could end up saving a lot of time and money and heartache by just
Yeah.
getting FDA buy-in rather than just trying to submit and hoping for the best.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep. So there are four four different sections of the FDA. There's CBER, which is the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, CDER, the Center for Drug and Evaluation and Research, CDRH, the Center of Devices and Radiological Health, and then OCP, the Office of Combination Products. And so with that, the first thing that you want to make sure you understand is what product designation of the FDA will apply to your product. For the majority of medical devices, especially ones that do not have drugs attached to them, they are going to fall under CDRH. This designation will 100% impact what FDA Center has authority over your application and what requirements will be applied to your application. Um, as I was mentioning, there's four possible centers that'll have jurisdiction over your product. In most cases, it's going to seem obvious where your product will fall. I mean, if you're going to be a stent, you're not exactly going to be in the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. Just like if you're going to be a cancer drug, you're not going to be in the Center of Devices and Radiological Health. There is sometimes some ambiguity when it comes to what the product device is, or sorry, what the product is and what center it will fall to. And in that case, a company can always file for what's called a request for designation or an RFD to the FDA. And at that point, the FDA will tell the company what center their product is going to fall into. Uh,
So I'm sorry, excuse me.
no, no, go ahead.
are some of these easier or harder than other ones to get through? Or would
I
you say they're all essentially the same?
I wouldn't necessarily say that any are easier or harder. Um, I would say that they have different requirements for what you would need. If you have all the data necessary and all the safety testing and everything necessary to do your application, and it's good data, each and every one of these should be pretty simple and straightforward. Now, with that being said, some of these requires more intensive testing. Some of these requires further safety testing, animal studies, things like that. So, for instance, Center for Biologics and Research and Center for Drug Evaluation Research, cancer drugs, things like that, they require a significant amount of testing to prove that it works and to get on the market. And those can be very, very costly and very, very timely. And so the endpoints for something like that, it's way more extensive than it would be for, let's say, CDRH. Um, I don't want to say it's more complicated. It's just you have to have a lot more significant, thorough data for your application. There are some devices that are in CDRH, the Center of Devices and Radiological Health, that are considered general wellness devices. And in that case, you don't even need an application to the FDA. You just have to have a quality management system in store and make sure you have some safety testing in-house for yourself. And you can pretty much go out and sell on the market with an establishment registration for yourself and making sure that you're compliant to the FDA's QMS protocols or standards. Um, Long story short, CDRH could potentially be much easier, but given you have all the data and you can prove all the safety for everything, all of them can be a straightforward pathway. You just have to define that pathway and be able to back it up.
Great. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, just a little bit more about the request for designation, as sometimes it can be a little bit confusing on what center is going to have oversight over your product. So when you do submit for a request for designation, the FDA does have 60 days to respond, and then at that point in time, their decision is binding. So if you do have what you think is a medical device, but it does have some indications that would make it fall under potentially CDER or CBER, if the FDA comes back and says, nope, this is going to be a drug, you're falling under CEDAR, you no longer have the opportunity to go to CDRH. CEDAR will be reviewing your product at that point in time. Interestingly enough, though, if you are trying to fall under CDRH and the FDA does not respond within 60 days of your application for an RFD, your recommendation automatically becomes that designation. So the FDA has to respond to you.
Even if the government's shut down or something.
That is a great question. Off the top of my head, I can't answer that, so I'm gonna pass on that one, but we'll try to figure out that one for later on.
All right.
Great, great question though. RFDs are important, especially for startups, because it can validate the thinking on the product type to ensure the FDA is aligned with you from the very, very start. Uh, what I was somewhat mentioning before, CDRH, usually the endpoint for that is a lot less intensive than it would be for CEDAR or for CBER, just based on clinicals that you potentially may have to do. And so if you have a device that falls under the guidances of CDRH, I would say ideally you would want to keep moving with that device because sometimes it can be less tortuous to go through that pathway and less costly, less timely. Um, but just a word of caution with that. We've seen projects that have gone underway for over a year with people that haven't gone and done an RFD previously. And they're thinking that they are CDRH without getting the FDA's buy-in on that. And then once they have that initial pre-submission meeting with the FDA, and the FDA goes, nope, you're either following a CEDAR or CBER. All of that work that they've done to date, I don't want to say is gone and out the window because they still have that data. However, their strategy is completely changing at that point in time, and they're going to have to address the nuances of having to go a different pathway.
Right.
So not necessarily back to square one because they have the data, but they're the timeline is definitely getting extended and the plan is getting changed to say the least.
Right. Right.
Um, so regulatory pathway identification. So key impacts, there are different pathways for the regulatory path. In for the FDA for CDRH specifically, there's a couple um, different pathways. There's general wellness. There's class one devices, class two devices. Within class two devices, there's 510Ks as well as what's called de novos. And then there's class three devices, which would be called PMAs or pre-market authorization. What 510Ks are is a product that has already been approved as a class two device, and the product that you would be developing is matching the indications for that class two device. We call them predicate devices. And then a de novo device in a class two would be a product that has indications that are different than any other device that's on the market. And so you would have to do safety testing to prove that that device is safe with the different indications comparatively to other devices that are on the market. Um, Time to market for class one devices and general wellness devices, those devices are usually moderate or sorry, low risk to moderately low risk. And so those devices, without doing an application, you can be on the market as long as you have a quality management system on. So time to market for general wellness or class one devices is, I mean, it can range from anywhere from a week to 60 days, just depending on how quick you can get your quality management system up to speed. As for 510Ks, I personally like to say that they take about 8 months to 12 months. That would be inclusive of a pre-submission, and that's just me trying to mitigate risk, making sure you do everything the right way. Realistically, if you were to have an application and submit it today, the FDA timeline's roughly around 90 days to review it. You could potentially get your application done in 90 days and be at commercialization stage in that point in time. De novo is a little bit different. When it comes to application time, it is the same application time. You submit it. It takes roughly around 90 days for the FDA to review it. However, as de novo is a little bit more nuanced than a 510K, and you're going to have to most likely show some additional testing, usually that time could take little bit longer, as well as sometimes a clinical may be involved, which at that point you have to wait for the results of the clinical study and then submit. Cost structure between 510K and de novo is relatively similar. It could be more extensive once again with de novo, as you're going to have to provide additional testing, most likely, or clinical trials. Markability as well. A chosen pathway can enable marketing claims and differentiation or restriction if chosen poorly. So also a key consideration to think about. And early revenue. Faster, less burdensome pathways can generate revenue sooner, funding later developmental stages. There's a lot of products out there and a lot of products that I work with that they originally limit their claims significantly and they're a general wellness or a class one product, but their idea later on is to have it be a class two product. And so to get on the market, they don't obviously market the claims that they're going for, but they market it for some of the lower risk general wellness claims. They start generating some revenue. They use that revenue to move forward with the testing to prove the indications that they're really seeking, and then they develop that application.
Yeah, I've seen that done very effectively with some companies that
It,
I've
it,
invested
if
in. It's,
Yeah. If done right, it is I mean, a great pathway to
right,
success. I mean, you're generating revenue, you're gaining, I mean, user feedback on your device. I mean,
right,
if done correctly, it can be absolutely fantastic.
right. And you help with that. Is that's what you do?
Absolutely. I help with all of this. From soup
Right.
to nuts, we do it all.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So next, just going to jump into indications for use and intended uses. Um, So this is an area where you have a lot of latitude and strategic decision making, and it is really important when it comes to your device. So the FDA defines indications for use as the specific conditions or diseases for which a product is intended to be used for. And then intended use refers more broadly to what the product does. So these statements you develop should be an area of a lot of strategic coordination between your product development, marketing, and regulatory teams. In one case, a company may want to make aggressive claims as possible on what a product can do in order to establish a device unique position in the market. But that comes with the regulatory burden to scientifically support all those claims. So that's always the, I don't want to call it the chicken and the egg, but it's we want to do this, but then we have to test for this. And I think I run into a lot of clients that go, well, we know it does this. And I have to ask them, I go, okay, well, if you know it does that, what data do you have to support that? And they look at me and they go, well, we know it does that. We have to test that theory before you can just go and market for that.
Right.
And sometimes that testing to support it, it takes time and it can take a lot of money. Because you have to do it in a compliant and valid manner. Otherwise, the FDA is going to look at it and just say this is unusable data. Um, in other ways, a company may want to start with a more modern I cannot talk today. I'm so sorry. With a more modest list of claims to get to the market sooner and at a lower regulatory cost. And this is kind of what we were just discussing. Limit your claims, be on the market as a general wellness or class one device, go get some sales, and then use that money to move forward and actually start developing the claims that you want to actually bring to the market with that product. The decisions here will lead to other determinations too. With medical devices, I mean, the decisions for the indications of use and intended use, they were going to determine the risk, whether it's a class one, class two, or class three device, and then how the appropriate regulatory application process, such as 510(k) de novo or PMA, will follow. These decisions should be made as early as in the process as possible so that you can then validate them with the FDA and then your internal plans can be coordinated. All right, regulatory strategy, assumption, and errors. So the FDA has methods that you can use to validate your decisions on each of these to make sure they're in alignment with FDA thinking. Rather than getting surprised late in the process, requests for designations and Q submissions are just some of the tools that the FDA provides for companies to use. Uh, the more work you do in the beginning and the more time you spend based on incorrect assumptions, the more expensive it can get. If you have an idea to just move forward with all this testing because this company did it and you think that this is the correct pathway and you spend a whole lot of time and money on something and then you go through a Q submission process and the FDA goes, well, why did you do this when we would have liked to seen this? Well, you just wasted a whole lot of time and money. And they're going to make you go back and redo it in the manner that they see fit. And so that's also why, and I don't want to do my little pitch here on Accordo, but this is also why regulatory is so important. You have to make sure that you're doing the right testing immediately. You got to make sure that you're going to try to achieve the things that you want to do that are going to be accepted by the FDA. Without it, you are just going to be taking steps backwards and burning money at the same time.
And I might be jumping the gun here, but so are other regulatory uh, patterns in other countries similar to this?
hmm
So that so anywhere, so if you're going through the EU or if you're going through uh, uh, Asia or something like that, there it's the same basically in every country. Is that
So
correct?
it's not correct. There are a lot of similarities, but unfortunately, it is not correct. The same requirements that are going to be required for China, Australia, Japan, Europe, they're going to differentiate between what's done for the FDA. Now, the FDA is one of the more stringent markets to get into. And Europe has done a really good job recently. They've switched to the MDR to really kind of elevate their own system and to I don't want to say make it more difficult, but require more to get into the EU. And so with that, the FDA and the EU have a lot of similar structure that you can use, but I wouldn't say if you have a product in Europe that it'll automatically just be able to come over and use the testing for the US. But a lot of times, vice versa as well.
and vice
But
versa.
a lot of times, what we do though is we'll work with our partners that are either in Europe, or we've got our partners in Europe that have a company in the US that are trying to either come to the US and then go to Europe or vice versa. And we'll work with our EU partners on figuring out testing that both countries would need. That way, we don't have to do redundant testing, do it once, get the whole package for it, make
Right,
sure that both countries would accept it. And then if the EU would require some additional testing, obviously have to do that for the EU and vice versa with the states. If the states would require some additional testing, they would have to do that. When it comes to quality management systems, however, EU and US are pretty similar into that. They're all trying to get standard under, I believe the numbers, it's ISO 19483 to the QMSR. I'm gonna have to fact check myself on that, but I know they are trying to harmonize something so that there is some similarities in CGMP and compliance. But there are still differences around the world when it comes to regulatory applications.
great. Right, thank you. Yes.
Absolutely. So the FDA does have some methods to validate your decisions on each of these to make sure that they're in alignment with FDA thinking, rather than getting surprised late in the process. Oh, I already said this. Sorry, I apologize. With the RFPs and the Q submissions, um, lost my train of thought there. I'm gonna next. I'm gonna start to move to some of the things just to consider early on for projects. And so laying the foundation for success. So some of the key things here that are so important, especially for a startup, is record keeping. Design history files should always be kept. The FDA loves to see from start to finish how you got to where you got to, all your files, and just kind of a track record for what you did, any changes that you made, things like that. Material selection is also incredibly important. And it's also cost effective. Reducing testing by materials that have already met agency standards, super important. If you are using products that are already on the market that have already been validated by other people, you're going to save cost and money by trying to bring something nuanced into the market. And with that, partner selection is important as well. If you know that you're going to be using a product that create or that uses nitinol, go to a supplier that has been validated by the FDA and has been audited that creates nitinol. I mean, you know at that point in time you're getting good product from a supplied vendor or from an approved vendor that has the credentials to be able to make product for medical devices. And so early on, figuring out who those suppliers are going to be and materials that you're going to use, very, very important.
In
Uh,
my experience, doing due diligence on MedTech companies is that they have all their ducks in the row, for a startup. And if they don't, you don't want to have anything to do with them. Yeah, so record keeping, very, very important. Yes.
Yeah, it's pretty easy early on to kind of look at a company and just see if the roof's on fire or not. So, but yeah, as you were saying, I mean, some other early stage considerations. So, cyber devices, almost every product I see now, every pitch I go see now, it's either they want to put the product on the phone or at the nurse's station or on a computer, or there's an AI component of it. And that is going to lead to cybersecurity testing that needs to be done now, which is still I mean, it's very nuanced, it's very ongoing, it's very costly right now because people are still defining what that is. So it's just kind of food for thought for companies that are coming to market. It's it definitely is the hot topic right now in the med device industry. Everybody, I think not just med device, but everybody wants to use AI for something. They want to have it in every
Right.
platform, but there are fallbacks with it right now just because that area is still being defined of how it's going to be utilized, how it's going to be used. But other early stage considerations, record keeping, as I was mentioning for the design history files, it's very important to have that, especially when it comes to cybersecurity files, the design and architecture documentation and the SBOM, functionality of it, cyber capability components and applications, the cost and complexity of it, always something good to think about. And then once again, partner selection. You want to make sure everybody you're using early on is going to be validated and credentialed in this.
Great. Yes.
And then regulatory framework development. So risk analysis is the foundation. The FDA evaluates submissions largely through a risk-based lens, develop a formal risk analysis early to guide the application strategy. So why this is important early on, you want to be able to align with 21 CFR 820. And it's pretty straightforward. I mean, there's guidelines for these things. It's the intended use and user environment, hazard identification and analysis, your risk controls, your validation controls, and then, of course, post-market surveillance. The biggest things that you want to avoid, missing existing FDA guidance documents. I mean, if you're missing those in your system, obviously the FDA is going to catch on to that if they ever do an audit. There's over 600 current medical device guidances, and so there is a lot of them. And the FDA expects medical device companies to follow and know these applicable guidances. Sorry, there's a little comment at the bottom too. Do know what you do. Don't know what you don't know. That's never going to work with the FDA. If they come and do an audit and you just say, "Oh, I didn't know I had to do that," that's a that's an X mark next to the portion of that specific portion. So
But you guys know them all.
absolutely that's why it's in, that's my little 2 second pitch again. That's why it's important to have a good regulatory person in there. Check the boxes, make sure that you have everything up to date. The last thing you want to do is have an FDA audit come in and then just get a bunch of things that you have to come and fix afterwards. Because in reality, if you do have to go back and fix those things, the FDA could potentially take you off the market for the time being. So it's never good, or have a product recall until you finish all those things. So never good to stop sales.
Right.
All right. Gonna jump into predicate devices. And so this is almost specifically when it comes to class two devices that will be known as 510(k) devices. And so with this, carrying on the theme with avoiding common errors, just to discuss some things that we try to see with companies and when they identify medical devices for their predicate devices. Uh, we use we're using medical devices because it has clear parallels to other products such as drugs and ANDAs, where the task is bioequivalence through PK studies and similar therapeutic effects. When looking at med device predicates, though, you'll want to be careful that you avoid the most common errors we tend to see. First, you want to be sure that there's not newer predicate devices available. I meet with companies all the time that they're looking at a predicate device that was from 1970 or 1980, and they go, "Well, we want to go based off this one." Well, the rules may have changed a little bit since that 1970 or 1980, and there might be a newer device that came out in 2010 that proved safety standards that you can go test against. So sometimes it's much, well, it'll do you a lot of good to go out and find the newest predicate device more so than an older device. Next, make sure you don't have the incorrect match on the intended uses. A lot of people go out there and they see one predicate device and they go, "Oh, my device is just like this. We want to go for these same intended uses," although their product doesn't match the predicate's device's intended uses. That's another big faux pas. Third, make sure that there's no significant technology differences. I can't stress that enough. Uh, Sometimes there'll be a device that has the same intended uses, but the technology device or technological aspects of that device are completely different, and that's going to drive you away from having that perfect predicate device. Having sufficient data to support your claim of substantial equivalence, that's one of the main things. You pick a predicate device because you want to have data that's going to prove that you're substantially equivalent to your predicate device. That's what the FDA is going to look at. You don't have to prove superiority to that device. You just have to prove that it's substantially equivalent. Um, you also don't want to make split predicate mistakes. FDA used to allow combining two predicates to show substantial equivalence, one for intended use and one for technology. It doesn't really seem like that's the case anymore. And then last but not least, you want to check for violations. Look at the surveillance record of the product you want to use as a predicate. And if there are violations on that predicate, I would suggest avoiding it. All right, testing considerations. And this is just some considerations for streamlining your non-clinical testing strategy. First off, you want to make sure you use as many standardized tests as possible rather than attempting to develop your own protocols. For example, look up the ISO, USP, or IEC standardized tests that can be used for things such as toxicology, biocompatibility, electrical safety, things along that nature. Those and many other standards are readily available and out there. It's a lot easier if you use them when coordinating with labs because they'll already know the protocols and the FDA already recognizes them. So it's always good to not try to recreate the real on those.
And as you said earlier, uh, there it doesn't have to be in the U.S. There are other places
Correct.
that can have standard testing places that can be less expensive.
Absolutely. And that's something that I work with all the time. I have so many clients that they come to me and they ask for biocomp testing and they say they want to use a US lab. I go, okay, and I go out and I talk to some of my partners and I come back with proposals and the proposals are about 150 to $300,000 for biocomp in 26 weeks. And they go, oh my God, can we get anything less expensive with the same quality? And I go, we can, but it's not in the US. And so we've got partners around the world that have unbelievable labs that are up to standards. And I mean, sometimes we knock prices down. I mean, I've seen prices go from 100 and 150 down to 20 to 30,000. So it really just depends on the device, what they're testing, and what labs we're able to do, and also availability. Labs are they're getting busier and busier. There's a lot of businesses out there. Um, but yeah, anyways, I will keep moving on.
Right?
One of the biggest things when it comes to those labs, though, as we were just mentioning, especially the foreign labs, and this is one of the keynote most important things, especially if these companies aren't working with a company like Accordo who goes out and pre-vets these labs and make sure that they're credentialed. You have to make sure that these labs are properly accredited. The FDA is not harmonized 21 CFR 820 lab quality system requirements to ISO. And so if you go out there and you are looking at these labs and have not found a lab that has harmonized that as of yet, you could be going out, doing that testing, receiving the testing, paying for it, submitting it to the FDA, and then having the FDA looking at you and go, can't use it. So make sure more than anything else, the labs that you are using are properly credentialed. And then lastly, be cautious when sourcing testing services from low cost regions of the world. There's a lot of companies that do that. The FDA's issued a number of high profile warnings on this lately and disallowed the data generated by several labs despite them being credentialed. And so you just got to make sure you're really picking your partners correctly. The most common reasons are falsification of records and data integrity. This is a super hot button for the FDA right now. We always recommend that you would audit any FDA overseas labs before contracting with them. And then clinical considerations and strategic insights. We also have a range of practical suggestions for clinical studies. This is a really important area of focus because if a clinical study is required, it can make up the biggest time and cost of your project. First, be aware that the FDA is also not harmonized. It's credential requirements to ISO 15189. This is another area of caution for European companies. The FDA requires that labs used for assessing clinical studies be CLIA certified. And the FDA has been known to accept data from non-CLIA providers if they can show GLP compliance in ways that we won't go into today, but it's easier just to select a CLIA lab from the starting point. Another area of caution is using non-US populations for clinical studies. The FDA has a very strong preference for clinical studies to be performed in the US to ensure proper demographic alignment. That's not to say that clinicals outside the US can't be used, but they might. In many cases, the FDA is most likely going to like to see if you've done a clinical outside, that those are going to match the same results inside the USA. Um, if you, one of the biggest things too, if you are going to do an outside the US OUS trial, you can always get insight on from the FDA with an interaction with the FDA through a Q-sub, and so that's always a possibility. And then some final testing considerations very early in our development process. I think you'd want to consider your development data in a regulatory application later, or if you'll want to reuse testing data from an EU MDR in a USA application. I've had many clients who have had stacks of data that was generated along the way that is unusable due to being collected without protocols or being generated by non-credentialed sources. And a lot of the time, our clients get rather upset by that because obviously they went out and they got all this data, but they did it in a non-compliant manner, which or with non-credentialed sources, which we understand that they went and spent the money, but this is one of those things. If you do it right the first time, you won't have to go and do this again. There's always an additional cost to having to do additional testing. It's just always good to do it right the first time. Additionally, we always tell our clients give some thought if they are going to go to the market first in Europe or in the US. Because if you do go to market in Europe first and you want to use it for a US application later, there are going to be some tests that could be applicable to both. And so work with a company that does have a partner in the US or in the US and in Europe or a different branch and just make sure that all those tests are lining up. The last thing you want to do is to do a EU application and then have the data just be good for that, but go have to do the same exact testing in a different center that's going to be applicable for the US. And so I'm going to just jump into some interactions with the FDA. And so I'm going to try to explain this to the best of my possibility. But there is a process to engage with the FDA called a Q submission. And so what a Q submission is kind of this overall umbrella of interactions within the FDA. And under that umbrella, there is 5 different methods to interact with the FDA. So there's the pre-submission process, there's submission issue requests, study risk determinations, informal meetings, breakthrough device designation request, and the step entrance request. So for me, the most popular one, the one that I do more than anything else, is the pre-submission. This is an actual interaction with the FDA, usually resulting in a meeting with the FDA. You create a dossier of testing strategy. You submit it to the FDA. The timeline for that is about 75 days to actually get that meeting with the FDA. You show them your testing strategy, show them your plan. Usually, leaving that meeting, you can kind of get a thumbs up or thumbs down if you're kind of going the right direction with what you want to do. Following that, I mean, if the FDA buys into your testing plan, following the pre-submission, so you don't go and waste any money prior to it. If the FDA gives you thumbs up that you're going the right pathway, go accomplish those tests, get all your data, and then write up the report, put it in the application, and submit after. Usually, what I like to do is it's a 2-step process to get clearance or approval through the FDA process. It starts with the pre-submission and it ends with the actual application process. The second one that's not the pre-submission is the submission issue. An SAR, it's FDA feedback, it's FDA written feedback, or it can sometimes be a meeting to just address issues for a market submission hold letter or a CW hold letter, IDE or IND. Then there's a study risk determination meeting. It's a request for the FDA to for whether a planned medical device clinical investigation is significant risk, non-significant risk, or or from most requirements under the IDE regulations. And why this is important is for if during a pre-submission, a FDA comes to you and says that we seem to deem your product with a significant risk, meaning that you're going to have to get an IDE and perform a clinical. You can end up having the study risk determination with the FDA to try to lower that. It doesn't mean it's going to work every time, but at least you can make your case for why you are justifying it not to be a significant risk device or a low risk device because it could potentially lessen the burdensome of testing for your clinical. Informational meetings throughout the FDA. It's just a request to share information with the FDA without expectation of feedback. And then breakthrough device designation request. This is actually a key for some products going through the FDA. It's a request to get into the FDA's breakthrough device program. There's certain criteria that one would have to apply for to get in. What this does is it almost basically gives you a liaison at the FDA to help you in contact with you along your application process. I think where most people mess up with this is that they think that this is going to give them the ability to cut corners. There's going to be a shorter timeline. They almost get to cut the timeline, or there's not going to be as much testing. It's not the case at all. What this does is the FDA brands you into their breakthrough device designation program, and you're going to be able to have more interaction with the FDA and ask them some more questions along the process of doing your application. So it doesn't speed it up at all, but it does get you some more interaction, which could answer some questions along the way and help develop your application. And then last but not least is the STEP entrance program. And it's just a request, almost like the breakthrough device designation, into the safer technologies program. So tips for a successful Q submission meeting, clear and focused questions. And a lot of this has to do with the pre-submission meeting because that is the majority of the meetings that I have with the FDA are going to be those pre-submission meetings. Clear focused questions are key. You want to limit to target questions that truly get the FDA input. FDA is not going to make decisions for you. They'll provide feedback and guide your approach. But if you show up to the FDA meeting and you say, "What do I do?" you are going to sit there for an hour in dead silence, and they are not going to say anything. Come prepared. Make sure that the questions that you ask are the correct questions. And so I put some of these questions framed just to make it easier so everybody understands. Don't say, "What predicate should I use?" That's one of the worst things ever. If you haven't done your homework and you're just asking them, I mean, you might as well just be watching watching a wall get painted. It's just doesn't work. A better question to ask would be, does the FDA agree that predicate device X is an appropriate predicate device? Yes or no question. Super easy for them to answer. And at that point in time, if they say no, you could ask, why does that predicate not match up for your thoughts? Another thing when it comes to testing strategy, don't go in there and go, "Well, we have this product. What test should I do?" FDA is not going to give you the answer. A better answer would be, we could not identify a standard test to attribute for this product. Does the FDA agree that this test or this attached protocol would be appropriate for this product? And so with that, it's really trying to develop and get the FDA's insight on how are we going to make this successful? Don't tell me what to do. I'm going to work with you on developing the safety testing for this product. And one of the biggest things too, provide sufficient background information. Submit a concise dossier. Obviously, include the device description, design details, and intended use. You only get an hour with the FDA, and granted, you're gonna provide them with information about your product, but this is one of the first times that they're going to be having a conversation about it. So they need to be almost as knowledgeable as you are to be able to discuss the kind of strategic plan moving forward. So the more information that you can provide them on this product and the nuances of your product, the more beneficial it's going to be for you on the end. Come prepared. It's kind of that age-old saying, I mean, failure to prepare is preparing to fail. It's the same thing here. Get the FDA prepared to discuss your product and make sure that you have framed questions that you need answered to help provide strategic input to move forward with your application. And then product development pipeline, leveraging letter to file. This is just for some people. A lot of people think that every time that they get one 510K on a product that they're going to have to get another 510K on the same product. Not always the case. There's things called letter to files on a specific 510K. And basically what this is if you're changing small aspects about your product, like let's say you create a product that's blue, but you want to change it to green, it's a letter to file. If there's some small cyber updates to it, things like that, you're not changing the core components of it, it's a letter to file. You're changing some manufacturing processes, it's a letter to file. Now, when you would have to do a new 510K, you're expanding its intended use. If you're changing it, let's say the product was this is a great example. If you're changing it only from a product being used for adults and now you want to use it for kids as well, that could potentially be a new 510K. If you're changing the size of a device, let's say it's whatever device you're using is 10 centimeters, but you want to make it much bigger for a different indication, new 510K. If you're having something, let's say a personal instance I've had was for a hernia product that was used in the stomach, and it was a great hernia product, but some doctor had the idea that he wanted to use it for a rotator cuff shoulder replacement patch. Completely different than doing a hernia patch, even though the device was exactly the same. Had to go out and test those things, was still a 510K, but it was a separate 510K. And then one of the last ones, changes in sterilization method or packaging. Anything that you're going to be doing that's going to be changing the product per se, even the packaging, you're going to have to go and apply for another 510K application. And then 510K versus de novo. So this is going to be class two devices. So 510K, the basis of it, you're going, you're creating a product that you're going against a product that's already on the market. So that product that's already on the market is going to be called a predicate device. We spoke about this a little bit before. It's typically a faster way to the market. It costs less because that pathway is already defined. It leverages on the data from the predicate device to show substantial equivalence. So you're not recreating the tire here. You're just matching what somebody else has done. It's a lower testing burden usually because of that, more than de novo or PMA. There's more predictable timelines because that pathway has already been done once, so you can ideally follow the same pathway that a competitor did. And it supports incremental innovation with modest design changes. So you can have some differences, but the overall indications and intended use for your product is going to have to be the same under the 510K pathway. Now, some, I don't want to say cons against the 510K, but more some things that you can't do within a 510K. Limited ability to make novel claims. You can't say that you're the exact same as a product that's on the market and say, but we also do this. That doesn't work. If you say, hey, I'm a product that's going to help the shoulder, you can't also claim that you're out there and you can cure cancer. Just doesn't work. You don't get a 510K because of that. You would have to go test for all those things. And at that point in time, you're in a whole different ballpark. Wrong predicate choice can lead to costly delays or rejection. That's kind of one of the cons of 510Ks. And this is all about really getting it right at the start, making sure that you know what your product does, the intentions, the indications for use, and the intentions for your product, and matching that up to any predicate that's out there. And then the perception risk, investors or customers may view it as me too versus novel innovation. I mean, that's a risk for any business. If you are creating a product that's already on the market, you're going to have a good story for your investors of what differentiates your product to the products on the market. At the end of the day, the indications have to be the same. It's got to be substantially equivalent. And so you have to really have something new without putting yourself in the de novo class, for those investors to explain to them, why am I different? And a lot of that could be marketing and sales channel of just how you're going to approach the sales channel. But when it really comes down to the product, the indications for that product have to remain the same. Now, when we come to de novo, this is going to be the availability for new claims. So it's for not novel to low moderate risk devices, no suitable predicates, establishes a new device classification, and it can create market differentiation in the first in class device. And so one of the great benefits about having a de novo is when you create a de novo device, you would be the first company out there ever getting this new device classification. And so what that means is you're going to create the entire testing strategy to put forth in front of the FDA, get their buy-in on it, go accomplish those things. And granted, the FDA rubber stamps it and gets you the 510K, or sorry, the de novo clearance. Um, any other company that would try to come and get those indications, they would have to perform the same testing to prove substantial equivalence to your device. So at that point in time, you're really setting the bar. But if you are a de novo device, you get to make market claims that nobody else on the market will have been able to make as long as you can provide the testing for it. Some of the cons of the de novo, it can be longer and more costly than the 510K, and this is solely due to the device. If the device is a higher risk device, there's going to be more safety testing provided for it. If there's a cyber component of it, you're going to have to do some cybersecurity testing. There's there is essentially a higher upfront burden in preparing the justifications for it and the evidence package, which could cause delays in the total timeline. Um, but once again, it really just depends on the product. And to develop the strategy for de novo, you most likely will need, I mean, a pretty strong regulatory team, quality and clinical expertise. Oops, there we go. All right. So just a little bit
Oh,
about
this is
timelines.
interesting.
uh, quickly about timelines. So average 510K compliance timeline, regulatory strategy development. So for every regulatory company is different. This is specifically to my company, Accordo. So usually when we get or when we engage with a client and they have a lot of documents ready, in about 30 to 60 days, we're able to develop that application strategy, sorry, pre-submission application strategy. It's a dossier, and our timeline really for how we perceive a project is get in front of the FDA and FDA interaction via pre-sub, and then following that pre-submission, go out and develop, sorry, not develop, execute all the tests, and then create the application for the FDA. So by this, our timeline, regulatory strategy developed before that pre-submission meeting, I would say 30 to 60 days, 1 to 2 months. And then we have that pre-submission meeting with the FDA. Now, once we submit for the pre-submission with the FDA, the second that that goes in, the clock starts. It's a 75-day wait until we can have that actual meeting with the FDA. There's nothing we can do about it. The FDA could say, hey, we've reviewed it within a week. We want to set it for this date. I've never had that happen. Is it possible? Sure, in theory. Does it happen? It hasn't happened to me yet, and I would love the FDA to come and prove me wrong. But usually you're waiting 75 days for that.
Oh,
So following that meeting with the FDA, we get the thumbs up or thumbs down on the strategic testing plan that we put in place. And so with that, then we go out and we execute that testing, whether a clinical is involved, whether it's mechanical testing, whether there's biocompatibility that needs to be done. Usually that's kind of the brunt of the work. And it could take anywhere. I mean, if it's a clinical and they require 1 year follow-up, I mean, you're looking at 12 months following the actual, and there's nothing you can do about it. The FDA says we
right.
want to see that, and it's 12 months, it's 12 months. Ideally, though, especially with a lot of 510Ks, there's not too many clinicals, and if so, they're much smaller. But we usually expect a 510K to be between I would say 8 to 12 months. And so that device testing and data development, I would say it's between 6 and 7 months. And simultaneously, while that testing is being done, I mean, this is ideally all during all that testing, we're getting check-ins, we're getting results back. It's looking like everything's moving forward. We can really start to draft the 510(k) submission. And with that, once the final testing is done, we have the submission packet ready. We input all the data into it. We apply it to the FDA. So once the application is submitted, the FDA has 90 days to review it. Once again, they could get back in a day. I've never had that happen. But the FDA gets back within 90 days. They might have some questions. If they do have some questions, there's a timeline that the sponsor would have to address those questions the FDA had, and then return to back to the FDA for them to answer. Usually, I think it's like 30 to 60 days that the sponsor would have to answer. It might be a little bit more than that. But usually, after we do the actual application submission, it's about 90 days until clearance. Simultaneously, once we know that we're going to be doing the application, it is very, very important to get a quality management system in place. The second the product gets 510(k) clearance, the FDA and sorry, gets clearance and is commercialized, the FDA will be able to audit the facility. And so you can get shut down before you even get started if your manufacturing processes aren't in place, if your quality supplier agreements aren't in place, if your adverse event reporting system isn't in place. So getting that quality system validation completed prior to getting the 510(k) clearance, it's an absolute must. That really has nothing to do with the application process. It just needs to be done prior to clearance of the actual device. Um, and then establish registration as well. It doesn't matter how big or small you are. Every year, the FDA charges an establishment $7,500 just to sell their product. It's very easy to do. It takes about 20 minutes online to do. It's just something that needs to be done. And then there's another program called the FDA Small Business Designation, which I will get into on the next slide, I think. And I got to keep hitting the right buttons. There we go. All right, FDA special programs. So there's the TAP program, Total Product Life Cycle Advisory Program. It's frequent FDA engagement across the product life cycle. Use it for innovative or complex devices. And some of the potential cons of it are it's high resource commitment and limited acceptance, and it may raise FDA expectations. Then, as I mentioned before, there's the breakthrough device designation, priority review, intensive FDA guidance for devices addressing serious and debilitating diseases. First in class, or sorry, when to use first in class or significantly improved devices for life-threatening conditions. Potential cons, greater scrutiny. And that is one thing about the FDA. If you do get into this program and you do get their input all the time, they have the ability to see every step along the way. So greater scrutiny, ongoing interaction demands, and pressure to accelerate timelines. And then last but not least, the STEP program, Safer Technologies program. It's similar to the breakthrough device, but it's more focused on devices that improve safety of already existing devices. When to use devices that address important safety gaps in current treatment and diagnostics, and then potential cons, narrow eligibility, fewer recognition market advantages than breakthrough. And then last but not least, FDA programs, the small business designation. And so why this is, and I'll try to move it so we can see the bar a little bit better. That didn't really work at all. Yeah,
I think
that
I'm
works.
seeing it all right. Oh,
Okay. So the small business designation, it's an FDA program with companies under 500 employees, or I believe revenue of under $1 million a year. I now have to double check that. I apologize for not putting that on here. It reduces your user fees from about 1/4 to the standard rate. So it's major savings, especially for a
oh,
startup.
right.
The one I love to point out for class 3 devices, which are devices such as heart valves, neurological stents, things like that, class 3 devices, which would be PMAs, it would be near $600,000 for your standard application, and with the small business designation, it takes it down to about 150,000.
Oh,
So significant cost considerations
right,
for 510Ks. I believe that it's roughly around $35,000 for a 510K, but with the small business designation, you can get it down. I think it's right around like 12, 7 to 12, I want to say, something along those lines. Um, it's something that you have to renew annually, but it is a very, very important thing to save a ton of money for these small startups, especially as everybody's
right,
getting going.
right. Wow, I had no idea. That's really interesting.
And that is all I have for today, but I would be so happy to answer any questions that you have for me or
Yeah, Mohammed. So I've been poking at him the whole time. Any other questions?
I think one thing, Martha, too, and I know this for investors, especially that's super helpful that we didn't really discuss is one of the main reasons that I like to do pre-submission meetings, and this is it really is for startup companies. Following that pre-submission meeting, during prior to the pre-submission, you can develop the strategy, you can develop the testing validation, and then you have that pre-submission meeting. If the FDA buys in on everything that you are doing at that point in time, you have an idea to commercialization, and you also have an idea of the cost. And so one things that, and I go to so many of these startup shows, everything the panels ask, the number one thing is, how much is it going to cost me? And when are you going to start selling? And so getting that validation from the pre-submission meeting, it goes miles. And so one thing that I also offer for companies and even companies that have their own regulatory, or I offer this for investors as well, is the ability to do due diligence on their companies. Look at their regulatory strategy, look at their regulatory plan, make sure it makes sense, make sure that the numbers that they're offering are pretty valid, and make sure their timeline is accurate. I
Right,
can't tell you how many companies I see that go, we're going to be on the market in 2 months, and it's going to cost us $100,000. And I go, what testing are you going to do? And they go, no, we're just going to make the product. That doesn't work.
right. No, no, yeah. But it's very helpful to have an idea. I really loved that timeline that you put out for the 510K product at the end there. That's really nice to get a sense of what you think is a reasonable timeline for that. And that will be very helpful
Oh,
for me when I
great.
look at MedTech companies and that sort of thing. That's excellent.
I'm glad to help, and always happy to jump on a call and speak with any med tech companies that you're talking to. I
Okay.
mean, I'm kind of sick. I love to work. I mean, med tech is my life, so always seeing new innovative companies is what I live for. That's why I go to so many shows. I love seeing
Yeah.
what's next. So I
It's
happy to join any calls.
it's really fun, isn't it? I love to see the future. And med tech is such an interesting area. There's so many amazing things that are happening in there. Yeah, I really like it too.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more.
All right. Anything we're missing? Any other questions? All right. Anders, thank you so much. This was really, I learned a lot of good information, and I've recorded it all mostly. Maybe I'll stop it now and thank you for your time and